so many strong, powerful, inspiring women doing really amazing things, and I didn't expect that, to be honest. Previous winners next to those legends, like, what are you talking about? It's just like crazy.
There's a moment in sports that you can't manufacture, can't script, and can't plan in a marketing meeting. A moment where the room just stops, where the person who's supposed to be the most intimidating figure in the building suddenly looks like they've forgotten how to speak. And that moment happened in Madrid, in front of cameras, with the entire tennis world watching, and it involved a 20-year-old from the Philippines named Alex Eala. Now, if you don't know who Alex is yet, that's kind of the whole point of this video, because by the time we're done here, you're going to understand exactly why what happened in Spain wasn't just a cool clip that went viral for a day. It was a signal, a crack in the wall of how professional tennis has always decided who belongs and who doesn't, and it came from someone who nobody in the traditional power structure ever saw coming. So let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why that moment hit so hard, you have to understand the road that led to it, and that road was not a straight line. It was full of ocean crossings and homesickness and years of grinding in a language that wasn't yours in a country that wasn't home, chasing something that most people around you didn't think was actually possible. Alex grew up in the Philippines with a racket in her hand before most kids her age had figured out what sport they even liked, and the talent was obvious early, not in a manufactured, overhyped way, but in that quiet, undeniable way where coaches just look at each other and nod because they know what they're seeing. She was the kind of player who made everything look a little too natural, the footwork arriving on time, the swing connecting clean, the competitive instinct already sharper than it had any right to be at her age. Word travels fast in tennis circles when a prospect is genuinely special, and it traveled all the way to Mallorca, to an academy built by one of the greatest players the sport has ever produced, Rafael Nadal. Getting recruited to train there isn't a small thing. It's not a summer camp invite or a participation trophy. It's one of the most serious training environments in professional tennis, built on a philosophy that winning isn't something you stumble into. It's something you construct, deliberately, painfully, day after day, with no shortcuts and no illusions. And Alex didn't just visit. She relocated, packed up her life as a teenager, said goodbye to her family, to her friends, and to the familiar, and moved to Spain. Think about what that actually means for a second. A young girl from Southeast Asia moving alone to a Mediterranean island, surrounded by people speaking a language she didn't yet understand, in a training environment designed to push her to the edge of what she thought she could handle, competing against peers who already had years of European clay court experience built into their legs.
I mean, that's an honest truth to, like, getting to the top, is that it takes mental fortitude and not shy.
People, if they're being honest with themselves, would fold under that kind of pressure, not because they're weak, but because that's a genuinely hard situation, and there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that. But Alex didn't fold. She adapted, and then she thrived. The Spanish didn't come from a classroom or an app on her phone. It came from necessity, from having to communicate with coaches, with training partners, and with the people running the facility, and from navigating daily life in a place where English wasn't the default and you either learned or you struggled. That kind of immersion does something to a person. It doesn't just teach you words. It teaches you confidence, because every conversation you survive in a foreign language is a small proof that you can handle uncomfortable situations, that you can walk into a room where everything feels unfamiliar and still find a way to belong. And that's exactly what those years in Mallorca were building inside Alex Eala. Not just a better backhand, not just improved movement on clay, but a self-assurance that you genuinely cannot
really well. And I think there's a lot of things that make her opponents feel very uncomfortable.
Fake, the kind that comes from having already done hard things and knowing in your bones that hard things don't destroy you. Meanwhile, back home in the Philippines, the tennis infrastructure that most top players take for granted simply doesn't exist. There are no deep-pocketed federations covering travel costs, no systems guaranteeing entries into the right tournaments at the right time, and no safety nets catching you if a bad run of results sends your ranking sliding. Every point Alex earns on tour is fought for against the backdrop of real financial and logistical pressure that most of her opponents never have to think about. When a player from the United States or Spain or Russia has a rough stretch, there's an apparatus around them absorbing the shock. Coaches, sponsors, national program support. When Alex has a rough stretch, the margin for error is considerably smaller, which makes everything she's accomplished even more striking when you lay it out plainly. In 2022, at the US Open Girls
Cada vez que vengo aquí siento muy cómoda, siento en casa. Llevo muchos años aquí en España, pues nada.
Singles draw, she won it, becoming the first Filipino player in the entire history of the sport to win a Grand Slam junior title, not just in a generation, not in the modern era, but ever, across more than a century of professional tennis competition. That's the kind of sentence that deserves a pause, because it's easy for numbers and records to blur together when you read them quickly, but consider what it means for a country to have never had that and then to have it, and to have it come from this 20-year-old who moved abroad as a teenager and learned to compete in a foreign language on foreign clay while figuring out who she was as a person and as an athlete simultaneously. Since then, the transition from junior success to professional credibility has been anything but automatic. It never is, because junior tennis and professional tennis are genuinely different sports in terms of what they demand mentally and physically, and plenty of players who dominated the junior circuit have disappeared without a trace once the real competition started. Alex hasn't disappeared, she's climbed, steadily, into the top 100 in the world, earning her place in main draws at the biggest tournaments on the planet and doing it without the structural advantages that most players at her level benefit from. Now let's talk about Madrid, because this is where the story gets electric. The Mutua Madrid Open is one of those tournaments where the atmosphere is genuinely unlike almost anywhere else in tennis. The Spanish crowds are passionate in a specific way, not just loud but knowledgeable, able to tell the difference between a player who's genuinely connecting with them and one who's going through the motions, and they respond to authenticity with a warmth that can completely change the energy of a match. And into that environment walks Alex Eala, and before a single ball is struck, footage starts circulating. Alex, in a press setting, in conversation, speaking Spanish, not haltingly, not with the careful deliberateness of someone who's memorized a few phrases for the occasion, but naturally, fluently, with the rhythm of someone who's lived in the language rather than studied it. The clip travels fast, as clips do now, but it keeps traveling because people keep watching it and keep sending it to other people, and the reason for that becomes clear when you see who's standing beside her. Aryna Sabalenka, the world #1, a player who has dominated women's tennis with a kind of focused intensity that borders on overwhelming, who won her third Australian Open in 2025 just months before Madrid, who is known as much for her magnetic, commanding presence off the court as she is for her ground strokes on it, and a woman who is genuinely difficult to surprise, who walks into press conferences with the energy of someone who owns the building and who, watching Alex speak Spanish in Madrid, goes completely quiet. Not politely quiet, not nodding along quietly, genuinely, visibly stopped in her tracks, the way you are when reality doesn't match the assumption you didn't even realize you were carrying. And that's the part that makes the moment stick, because Sabalenka's reaction is honest. It's not performed shock, it's not comedic exaggeration. It's a real person confronting an unconscious expectation that just got dismantled in front of her. The expectation wasn't malicious, most unconscious assumptions aren't, but it was there, the quiet background assumption that a Filipino player in Madrid would be grateful, would be deferential, and would be in the room as a guest rather than as someone who belonged there completely. And Alex, without making a speech about it, without calling anything out, just by being exactly who she is, fluent, confident, at ease, made that assumption visible by contradicting it so thoroughly that even the most dominant player in the sport couldn't hide her surprise. Social media split on the moment the way social media splits on everything. There were people who found it profound and people who questioned why linguistic ability was being treated as newsworthy, and honestly, both reactions are worth thinking about, because the people asking why it matters are missing the context, and context is everything here. The reason it resonated so powerfully wasn't just that a Filipino tennis player speaks Spanish, it's the accumulation of what that fact represents. It's the years away from home. It's the teenager in Mallorca who had no choice but to learn because survival required it. It's the cultural integration that happened not as a strategy but as a consequence of genuine commitment. It's the fact that it landed in the lap of the world #1 in a way that produced genuine, unguarded silence. Strip any one of those elements out, and the clip becomes less interesting. Keep them all together, and it becomes a story about belonging, about who gets to walk into elite spaces and own them rather than just occupy them, about whether geography and passport and federation funding are the actual prerequisites for excellence or whether we've just been acting like they are because the data historically supported it. Tennis has been slow to question its own assumptions about where champions come from. The tour's depth remains concentrated in a relatively small number of countries, European nations, the United States, and a cluster of Eastern European federations that have developed serious pipelines for producing professional players. Southeast Asia has been largely invisible at the tour's highest levels, and while that invisibility has always been explained through infrastructure deficits and funding gaps, Alex's presence increasingly makes that explanation feel incomplete. Because she came from the same deficit, faced the same funding gap, and is now in main draws at major tournaments, making the world #1 stop mid-sentence in a press room in Madrid. The infrastructure argument starts to look a lot shakier when someone proves it's possible from the other side of it. What's genuinely exciting about where Alex is right now is that she's not a finished product. She's still developing, still adding layers to a game that already has real weapons, real movement, real competitive instincts that opponents have described as making them uncomfortable in ways that are difficult to pinpoint and harder to prepare for. Clay suits her, which matters in a sport where Madrid and Roland Garros represent two of the biggest stages on the calendar, and her comfort on that surface is only going to deepen with experience. The gap between where she is and where Sabalenka is remains real. Let's not oversell the moment into something it isn't, but the gap is narrowing, and it's narrowing at the kind of rate that makes the next 2 or 3 years genuinely worth paying attention to. The viral clip didn't create Alex Eala's story, it just forced a lot of people to finally pay attention to a story that was already being written, quietly, on courts in Mallorca and Manila and New York and now Madrid, by a 20-year-old who crossed an ocean as a teenager, learned a language through sheer necessity, became the first player from her country to win a Grand Slam junior title, climbed into the top 100 in the world without the advantages most of her peers rely on, and then walked into one of tennis's most passionate atmospheres and started speaking Spanish like she'd never left. Because in a very real sense, she never did, because Mallorca made her, and the court made her, and every hard conversation in a language she was still learning made her. And the product of all that making is someone who doesn't wait for permission to belong somewhere, someone who simply shows up, speaks the language, and watches the most commanding figure in the sport lose her words. Entirely. That's not a feel-good story. That's a restructuring of how tennis decides who matters. And it started with a 20-year-old from the Philippines saying something in perfect Spanish while Aryna Sabalenka stood beside her and forgot how to respond.